when you are doing your job right as a bass player, it's the best thing in the world. You make everybody else sound and feel amazing. And you can make the whole thing pop or fall flat. And you're really steering the ship, even if nobody knows it.
I've been familiar with the name Erik Higgins for years, but it wasn't until bassist and conductor Jonathan Lane reached out to me. I think he sent me a Facebook message, and he said, "Have you seen this guy play before?" And it was a link to this video that is just awesome. There's a link to it in the show notes, and we're actually going to use a couple clips of Erik and a clarinetist playing just this beautiful improvised duet. And Erik has had a fascinating path through the music world. I probably overused that phrase, but he really has. He started on the soloist path, I guess you would say. We talk about that. And he has moved into the world of playing chamber music. He's one of the few artists out there making a living as a chamber bassist. Tony Manzo, who I've had on the podcast recently, also does that, as do a few others. But it's not a large group of people doing this. Erik used to play in the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra, where Alexandra Scott currently plays, a past podcast guest. And he's currently a member of A Far Cry, and he also plays with the Handel and Haydn Society and is active in all sorts of different kinds of modern and period performance scenes. And what a deep thinker. Erik and I dig into an amazing variety of topics. I just had such a great time. In addition to talking about paths and careers in general, we talk about how being interested is such a key in everything. Your profession, practicing, getting better in an audition, all those kind of things tie back into just being interested. And this just resonated so strongly with me. His words are better than mine for this, so I'll let him speak to that topic. We've got some wonderful sponsors for the show. I'd like to thank D'Addario Strings and Upton Bass. More on both of them later. But let's dive into this conversation with Erik Higgins. You went to Indiana, right? I did. If I think of meat and potatoes double bass school, and I love Indiana, It's great. But I mean, known for producing a great quantity of excellent orchestral bassists, among other things. Can you maybe just talk about how you ended up in Indiana and maybe that progression into getting to Germany?
Yeah, so I met Larry Hurst at Interlaken. I went there when I was young, 16, I think, 15 or 16, for 2 summers. And from the time I was 12 to the time I was 18, I was very active in the ISB and also with the competitions and the American String Teachers Association and all that jazz. And by the time I was ready to go to college, I was actually a little confused about what I wanted to do. When I was really young, I wanted to be a solo bassist, but I didn't really know what that meant. And then I realized when I was 17 that if that meant playing concertos, that would mean playing these same pieces over and over again. But at that point, I didn't think they were very good anymore. And it was just kind of, I didn't really know what to do. And, but Larry Hurst was a very kind teacher and a very good mentor, I think. And he was the one that brought me to Indiana, where I kind of fished around for a few years. I was a political science major, double major for a while, a math major for a while, did all kinds of stuff there. So there was, when I was in junior, there was an audition for the Schleswig-Holstein Music Festival. I was just looking for anything, to get some new experience. Indiana is a very big school, and for a lot of people, I think it's hard for them to find their place there. And I was I didn't know what to do. I took one orchestra audition, and it was really disheartening to be candidate number 230 something. And, of course I was nervous and I didn't play well. And, I was just marshaled out of the room rather in short order. And, so I didn't really know where it was all going. And when I auditioned for the Schleswig-Holstein Festival, I was also had an interview the same day for Teach for America, and I was going to become a math teacher if nothing else worked out. So that's where I was at in undergrad. And but I will say, and we can come back to this later maybe, but I kind of stumbled across period performance practice at Indiana really randomly. I was going to be in the modern orchestra, the contemporary music ensemble there, and they already had a bass player, so they're like, well, Baroque orchestra needs a bass player. And I had no idea what it was about. I just did it, and it turned out to be something that opened up a lot of doors in the future, and something that brings me great joy now. So I'm really grateful for that.
Well, I love that it was Schleswig-Holstein. That was sort of the entry, you know. Yeah. And after your junior year, it was Small World. I did Schleswig-Holstein after my junior year. I think it was 1998 or something like that. And I remember it was my first time in Germany and heading over there, and the castle, Salzo Castle, right?
Oh my
and
gosh.
Rehearsals and that was one of my. I'd done a music festival in Russia before. There was this American Russian youth orchestra, but that was my first experience really getting immersed in Europe. And I remember walking the countryside up there by the sea, you know, looking at the cows, looking back at you, and just that whole experience. Wow. So what talk about that experience for you going over there to Germany and studying at Schleswig.
I'm sure you can relate to this, but I was just blown away that people would show up and pay to listen to rehearsals. You know?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, and not to mention you're in a giant, beautiful castle eating 3 beautiful meals every day with all these wonderful people and cows wandering out in the fields and a lake that you can swim in, and, you know, a sponsorship from a beer company with 400 kegs in one of the barns, you know. It was paradise.
Bass player paradise.
Yeah, I had a really wonderful time in Schleswig-Holstein. It really opened up for me, like, orchestral playing really as something in a new way that was new and interesting for me. And I realized that if I was going to continue studying music and bass, that I really wanted to go there to do it.
What were some of the contrasts? Because I've thought about this myself, you know, spending some time in Europe. Like, what are some of the first things you noticed, just maybe in terms of the contrast between the orchestral approach that you found at Schleswig versus what you were used to or had experienced in the United States? What were some of those initial differences you noticed?
It's a good question. I guess for the first time, all of my college education and my peers in the bass program, we were very focused on excerpts. Mm-hmm. And for the first time, I felt we, in our sectionals and in the rehearsals, we were really focusing on sound and blend. And I started to realize what bass function was in an orchestra. It had never really been clear before. It had always been like, you know, you need to play in time, and things need to be clear. And but you know, what is your function in an orchestra as a bass player? And it's different than when you're playing chamber music, I think, and it's different than when you're playing an audition. You know, there's certain things that are really important to do well, and that you blend well. And you know, it's not just you anymore. You kind of have to serve the whole picture. And that had never really occurred to me before. It sounds strange, but I never really knew how to play bass in an orchestra before.
Well, well, talk about a fascinating concept, like bass function. Like, what are some of and you do so much chamber playing, but then obviously orchestra playing. How do those two different roles, like how do you see the function differing between, say, playing, Trout Quintet and, you know, a Mahler symphony or whatever rep you want to pick?
It's a good question. And I'll jump to after I moved to Germany and I went to the Academy of the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra in Germany. Most orchestras now, at that time there were only a handful, but most orchestras now have these orchestral academies, which are training programs that you go and you stay there for a couple years and you play with the orchestra about halftime, and then you take lessons in chamber music. And I really got my sink or swim training with them as like the first American they had ever had in the academy, and definitely the first American bass player. And the first thing was they would always tell me, use more bow. You have to use more bow. There's more bow. You're not using enough bow. And it's like, but it doesn't sound good. It doesn't feel good. You know, I think when you're playing, and at that time I was and we as string players, I think you're looking after that very fine, tactile sensation when you have really good contact with the string and you feel really in control of the sound. And what it took me probably a decade to realize what they were talking about was you don't play the string, you have to play the top of the instrument. And sometimes that means kind of giving it a little more speed with the bow and taking the pressure off a little bit so that the whole body can ring. And it might not feel good under your fingers, but if you watch, for example, old videos of the Vienna Philharmonic, there's all these big guys just sawing away. You're like, how could that sound good? But it's a different focus. They're going for a different thing. And it took me a decade to realize what that was all about, because I could not understand. But they're going for a different kind of sound, a different quality of sound, and which is very specific to the kind of music that those big German orchestras are playing all the time. You know.
Is that something that you notice particularly in German orchestras, whether it's the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra or Berlin Philharmonic or whatever? Like is that style? Because I know exactly what you're talking about in terms of, you know, that bow usage and watching those amazing old videos of, you know, is that something specific to German orchestras? Just speaking about bass in general, like that, like, I don't want to say overbowing, but lots of bow, you know, that focus on the bow.
Yeah, that's hard to say, but I don't know very many other places where they do that.
Yeah.
At all. So I kind of feel like it is specific to the tradition they have there, also with the German bow. That's one of the only places in Germany and Austria where people play pretty much only with German bow. Yeah. And there's some things in the physicality of a German bow which lend themselves to that.
Yeah.
But it is, and I've noticed, you know, like with my time in Munich and also in the opera in Hamburg, where I played for almost 4 years, people, I guess, let's see. So I remember the first time I heard Bavarian Radio play, I walked in at the last minute, the day before my audition at the Academy, and got a last minute ticket at their main hall and heard them play some kind of, it was a concert with a bunch of like well-known pieces. And I just remember not hearing the bass, but feeling the bass, and not feeling it like hit my face, but come around and hit my back from behind. You know, it was this kind of, it was a completely different experience than I had been used to. And I think, you know, they really cultivate that sound. That sound, though, for example, I think there's something to an edginess and an attack that you get from, what do you want to call it, like more judicious bow use and more attack. That's really good for a lot of like later American stuff like Copland, or even other 20th century stuff like Stravinsky and stuff could use a little more edge, I think, a little more teeth. Almost always that sound wins the day for me.
One thing that has impressed me about Upton Bass ever since I got to know them was how many artists there are out there that are so satisfied with the work that Upton has done for them. Here's Mark Ramirez on his experiences having Upton copy his beautiful Cavani bass.
I do a lot of moving around and giving master classes and stuff like this. I had a copy made of it by the Uptons, by Gary and Eric Roy at the Upton shop. They made a copy of it, but they made an even smaller copy. I think it's a 7/8 copy of the bass. I use it now. I use that bass for my solo playing, which I do a lot. Recently, I've been doing a lot, especially here. And it has a detachable neck. The detachable neck, man, I tell you, in Europe, it's the craze.
Learn more at uptonbass.com, and thanks for sponsoring the podcast, guys.
And we took lessons from from whoever really in the orchestra we wanted to. Most often it was the principal player of whatever string group, but it wasn't necessarily. And in my time, I took lessons from several people, and also in this particular academy, we had what I thought was so funny. It was spelled out in the contract. We were going to receive mental training.
Mental training, really?
which turned out to be really wonderful sessions with a psychologist and about mental preparation and preparation for auditions. And it was fantastic. We also had a chamber music program. We performed a couple times as an ensemble of 18, but more often it was smaller chamber groups that we played concerts throughout the year, and it was wonderful. I think it's a really wonderful idea and a really beautiful way to get experience at a really high level and learn from people in the practice.
What do you remember what you covered in those sessions with the psychologist, the mental preparation sessions?
Oh, yeah. Well, at the time that I started, they were just switching from one to another. It had a lot to do with visualizations, and visualizing yourself doing well in an audition, creating a safe space in your mind for the audition. The guy who came in during the latter part of my time there specializes in practicing in flow. There's an American psychologist called Csikszentmihalyi who wrote several books on flow. It's kind of the same general trend as like the inner game of tennis, for example. But this psychologist in Germany had really fine-tuned that for musicians, and so we worked on finding flow in our practice and using different mental techniques to prepare for auditions and how to practice more effectively.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you remember any of the techniques that they recommended? This is the sort of stuff that people that listen to this love to hear. Like, what can I do to better myself, either for auditioning or just have a better practice session or get more into the game and performance? Do you remember any of the specifics that you guys covered?
I think what really helped me and when I was taking a lot of auditions was visualizations, visualizing yourself in the hall, getting used to the feelings that you get when you're going to get in the hall, imagining the people sitting in the chairs who are judging you. It's a really awful psychological position to be put yourself. Auditions are not fun for anybody, but just kind of getting accustomed to those feelings that you're going to have anyway, because they're going to be there. And I think what is often the biggest problem is you're not used to that. You practice all the time and you're in one state, and then you're in this new state and you don't recognize yourself or your playing. And to be able to say, oh, this is what's happening. I'm still okay. I'm still going to be able to play. And getting used to the different mental circumstances that you're going to be under. Play.
Now, and outside of an audition context, because we spend so much time thinking about auditions, but and then you win the audition, then you have the rest of your you have years and years, maybe with that group, and then you do all this chamber playing and playing. You're really featured as more of a solo instrument. I mean, are those techniques that you use in your day-to-day performing or preparation these days? Do you, for example, do you deal with any sort of, do you get nervous or fired up for a particularly big performance? Or do you use any of that stuff in your day-to-day life these days?
Yeah, of course. I mean, but I think I've refined it for myself, at least now, to a point where my basic rule of thumb is stay interested, stay engaged. Because the moment it becomes a task that you need to check off, you don't practice effectively. You don't bring joy to it. You're not investing joy into it, and when you're on stage, especially when you're featured in a way that people can really hear you, what you've invested in yourself musically is going to come out. So if you find joy in playing music when you're in a stressful situation, that joy will come out. If you've been beating yourself to practice and you get in a super stressful situation, that's what's going to come out. That's what people are going to hear. Yeah. And so, if you bring joy to your practice and I think one of the hardest things I found as you develop and progress is to find new ways to keep learning and stay interested. Because if you can find freshness and curiosity and joy in what you're doing, then that will come out in your playing, and you spread that to other people as well. And you can enable them to do the same.
Yeah, I can think of so many times in my own life where I've kind of lost that joy and it has become a task. And then I somehow was able to turn a corner mentally or find a different way to reframe what I was doing or just start something new. And that joy came back. And I look over the decades, that's happened over and over for me. Has that happened for you? Like has what you do become a task at a certain point? And if so, how did you find a way to stay interested or reignite that spark?
Yeah, that's happened to me many times already. And I think there were times when I thought that I could solve the problem by practicing harder and doing more. And sometimes that's not the answer. I think I got injured when I was in undergrad because I was trying to kind of force my way through problems. Sometimes the answer to the problems is to take it easy and give yourself a breather for a while. I've hit that wall several times, and sometimes it's worth powering through something. And I've made some what felt like really great breakthroughs after really striving for a while. But I've also made some of my biggest breakthroughs by just taking a break for a while. And, if I'm practicing, I think the general rule is if I'm practicing and I'm miserable, then it's not adding anything, I have to find a way to at least have it be interesting. I had a real brick wall several years ago because I just could not make myself practice for more than half an hour at a time or, at all. And at that time, I just realized, okay, I'm going to do my best when I'm working, when I'm rehearsing everything to really stay engaged and find little ways, but don't worry about the practicing by myself for a while, and for me, that kind of allowed me the space to realize that I was trying to make myself practice things that I wasn't really interested in practicing. But I wouldn't have realized that if I didn't step back for a while.
What a valuable realization to have Because and I just think about all those years that we spend in music school and how things are kind of drilled into it. Like I remember late Friday night in the Regenstein practice room at Northwestern, and like everybody's like, back to the salt mines, gonna go saw away. And just that putting in the hours, punching the clock, and how I think we just get these external expectations of what progress means, what practice means, what accomplishment means. So it's really cool to talk. I haven't really talked about this with anybody before, but it's fascinating.
I think you can do an extraordinary amount of work in an extraordinary short amount of time, if you really want to. Yeah. But you can waste an extraordinary amount of time and accomplish next to nothing if that's, if it's all your attitude. I was at a chamber music festival not in the far too distant past, and there was a miscommunication, and I realized that I was supposed to perform the Piazzolla Grand Tango cello version, like make an arrangement from the cello version and perform it, and in 3 days. And I don't know what happened. Like either I forgot or it went through, and I had to learn this on about 2.5 hours of practice. And it's possible. It's possible. It's in your attitude, and it's also like, for that example, I had to think, okay, what is it that makes this music tick? What is it important that I execute, and what is not important that I execute? And I just went for the things that I thought were important and didn't worry about the rest. And it was fine. It was great. It was really exciting.
Wow. I was chatting with Don Green. I'm sure you're familiar with the name, the performance coach, audition success and performance success. And he was saying the latest research indicates, we think of the concept of muscle memory, and the latest research indicates there really is no such thing as muscle memory, just like how mental all this that we do is, right? So like you're saying, I mean, a couple hours to do what you did in terms of the Piazzolla, that's, most people would freak out at that, but it's remarkable how much this really is a cognitive task that we're doing when we're playing music, making music.
Yeah. Well, and you know how it is when you're performing and you realize that you feel like, wow, all that practice I did, I can't feel it, like where did that go? Like it's a completely different feeling to perform than it is to practice. And it goes down to something deeper. And oftentimes what you thought you could do really well, you can't. And what you didn't think you could do, you can. And I just know that from personal experience. And so it's really exciting to find out that you're really capable of amazing things. And that are there kind of manifesting who you are as a musician, and not necessarily the time that you logged on a particular piece or a particular thing that you work on.
Right. This thing that we do is so much more holistic than we realize. Like 10 years ago, I started working out more consistently, and that made all of my performances better. And I feel like, what? How I probably practicing less and doing that, probably 10x'd some factor, my consistency and that sort of thing. And, you mentioned that you had went through a playing injury, right? In undergrad. I just put together this compilation of chatting with about a dozen people over the years who've gone through playing injuries. What happened for you in terms of that? Was it over practicing, or were you able to figure out what it was, and how did you get through that?
Yeah, it was tennis elbow and tendonitis in both arms. It started out in the left arm and went to the right arm. I think part of it was my technique wasn't really developed enough to handle the kind of stuff that I was trying to make my body do. And at that point, I was a little, like I said, I was kind of fishing around. I didn't really know what I wanted, and I was just trying to forced myself to do this thing, and so I was practicing in kind of an unhealthy way, and it changed for me. It doesn't, with injuries like that, it's not that you're like, you wake up after doing exercises for a while and you realize, okay, now I'm better. But it's kind of like it gets better and then it gets worse and then it gets better. And then one day you realize that you wake up and you realize you haven't thought about it for a week or two, and that actually it's okay. But it lives with you for a while. But it's also a great teacher, injuries. I mean, mine forced me to change my bow technique and to change how I was trying to play low notes, I think. And kind of forced me to realize that because I thought, of course, I was 22 and knew everything. I thought that I had the best technique anywhere. And so it forced me to realize that I had a lot to learn and a long ways to go. And so I don't want to say that it was positive, because it was not pleasant, but I think in the end it was, it forced me to come to terms with things that I didn't really want to up to that point.
One thing that D'Addario strings specialist Lyris Hung gets asked a lot is, how can you keep your strings in better playing condition? Here are her thoughts.
I get a lot of this question. You know, people often ask me, I don't want to spend a lot of money. What can I do? And I mean, my answer is unfortunately really, really simple. And that's just to clean your strings, to keep your strings really clean. And a lot of people, moan and at that, because they clean their strings. Most people will clean their strings, but not often enough.
There you go. Simple, huh? Keep that cloth handy and wipe down those strings after each use. Thanks to D'Addario for sponsoring the podcast. There's something I love, thinking back to that topic of just being interested. And then also, your early experience with all these different competitions, ISB and ASTA, and really digging into the bass repertoire. My guess is you knew your Kusevitsky and your Bottesini and those.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And at the risk of offending any bass players out there listening who think that Koussevitzky's the greatest composer since sliced bread, I mean, I think that your experience is not unique among people who've like really dug into that repertoire. And I just wonder, this is total speculation, but I wonder how someone in your shoes in like the violin world or cello world or piano world, like if they maybe would have gone that solo route just because of the expanded quality of repertoire. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah. I have a lot of thoughts.
Okay. I thought you might.
Well, the kind of changing moment came for me when I won the ASTA competition. Mm-hmm. I came in second when I was 15 and I won when I was 17, I think. Mm-hmm. And I just remember feeling this overwhelming feeling of disappointment, actually. I had worked so hard and I had really made a lot of progress, but I was still playing this piece that I didn't like. And I had played for my high school earlier that year. And even as I was on stage playing Koussevitzky for a full auditorium of poor souls, like there was polite applause, but it was not, I really wanted it to be something, but it wasn't. And I remember finishing the competition and just like, where does this go from here? And when I was in undergrad fishing around, I also, considered switching to the violin or the cello so there would be better repertoire, and quickly realized that there was no way I could catch up.
Yeah.
Ship had already sailed, but I came away with a really valuable lesson from all that. And, I think it's true. If I had been a violinist or a cellist in my own shoes, I would have gone a much different route. But I don't think I would be happier now for that, because I love playing the bass. I love learning the function of the bass. And when you are doing your job right as a bass player, it's the best thing in the world. You make everybody else sound and feel amazing. And you can make the whole thing pop or fall flat. And you're really steering a ship, even if nobody knows it. You are it. You're the most important thing. And you get to share that with people. You always get to share it with people because you're almost never playing by yourself. And that's a really beautiful thing. And I don't think I would have gone down my little route by myself and, missed out on that. And I think I would not be, I'm really glad, I'm really grateful that things turned out the way they did.
Well, and you've got this whole other component, or this, in addition to playing on, modern basses, you're doing work, Handel and Haydn Society and period playing. And I think you mentioned earlier that you started to get into that in Indiana. Can you talk about how you entered that world, and maybe we can dig into a couple takeaways or contrasts between that and modern playing?
Yeah. I came across it randomly. I wanted to take a break from the regular orchestras, and that was what was open at the time. I was fortunate to meet and work with Stanley Ritchie, who's a violinist, a period violinist at Indiana. And I think the first thing I noticed was how function driven everything was. It's like, you need to play in this way because of this and this and this. If you play the second and fourth beats loud, it sounds heavy. You have to, and all this stuff. And all of a sudden it just made sense to me. Very often in orchestra, up until that point, it's like, play and tune and play together. And I was like, that is so boring. Duh. But where does the, talk about music, how does the music function? And nobody would talk about that. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I was just so frustrated with that. And here I was in an orchestra where they're telling me, you need to do this because the phrase is going here. And if you emphasize here, then, it's not going to make as much sense. And, you know, he would come in, I took a solo Bach class of his where we would analyze these, you know, the different solo Bach repertoire, the cello suites, the partitas and sonatas. And he would give us this line. He's like, okay, find the bass voice, find the soprano voice. You know, we do these exercises, and he would come in really excited one day and like, I just realized I could think about this in a totally different way. And, you know, and there, all of a sudden there was room for creativity, and I had the tools to think about music in a creative way, not just like, how do I play it right?
Yeah.
It was like, there are lots of ways to play it, you know, and all of a sudden articulation and timing and kind of how you order the hierarchy of beats in a bar and how you order the hierarchy of bars in a measure, all of a sudden those were choices to make. And as a bass player playing in a Baroque ensemble, like, your choices then decide how it's going to be, basically. And I found that liberating and just a whole let loose burst of creativity for me in orchestral playing. And then I was hooked.
Yeah, it's almost like the rule, although there are, you know, the guidelines, there's a little more of that improvisatory feel. There's a little bit more of the rules are still being written kind of approach, even though ironically it's like older music, you know, we're talking about, but there's like, I think that's an experience that people have when they get into that world. Just like, and then just the different function that the bass has. I remember talking with John Feeney about this and just about the fabulous history that the bass has going back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years that a lot of people don't even realize. In part because of just the way that editors in the 19th century sort of, you know, edited the bass out of various pieces. But it's really phenomenal how rich and deep our tradition is. I mean, I think when it's hopefully getting better, but it's still the case when people think of the bass and chamber music, they think, oh, Trout Quintet and Dvorak Quintet, and that's it. And we'll call you in 3 years when you do one of those again. But the reality is, I mean, and especially when we open it up to period playing, the bass has been used for hundreds of years, and I mean, you're never going to run out of music to explore if you really consider the, you know, breadth of the repertoire.
Oh yeah, and I mean, there's so much repertoire and there's so much choice. You know, you can even say, oh, there wasn't necessarily a bass part, but there's a continuo part. And if you want, you can add a bass to that, or you can, you know, one of the most fun things about playing a big, you know, Baroque work is like, how do you organize the continuo for the various parts? You know, is this one going to be with bass and cello and harpsichord? Is this one with organ and bass? This one's just with bassoon, you know, like, there's choice, and there's so much repertoire.
I usually close out with some sort of question about advice for young people, and we can frame it a whole bunch of different ways. Because I think a lot of people are in that situation you were describing in their undergrad. You know, most of them probably haven't had all the competition success that you had, but they're like, I guess I could work for this orchestra job and be number 83, you know, at the next audition. And we see people like you or Tony Manzo or some other people that have found success, you know, in kind of creating I don't know if you want to call it a chamber music career, but maybe a less traditional career than the, you know, orchestral route that we see here in America. Do you have any advice for someone who's listening to this, who's 19 or 20 and is headed to the practice room, you know, as they're listening to this, just to maybe open up a few more doors for them, career-wise, stylistically, just however you want to frame it?
Well, yeah, I think the basic rule of thumb is there's so many ways to cut the cake. And you have to find something that you love, because if you don't do that, then it won't be a joy to put in all the hours that you will need to put in to make it work. For some people, that means learning how to play an orchestra. For other people, it's different things. I think the world of music I don't want to say just classical music, but music is changing a lot now. We don't know what jobs are going to be there or not be there in 15 years. And, but if you keep finding joy and curiosity in the things that you are doing, then it doesn't really matter, because you'll find a way to express that, whether it's forming your own ensemble or it's playing with an orchestra or playing a whole different kind of music. It doesn't really matter, because you will find that. And if you invest good feelings and joy into what you're doing, you will also attract other people who will open doors for you. And I think that's where I've gotten most of my work. That's how most things have happened for me, is people are attracted to that, and then that opens doors that you didn't even know were there before. I didn't know there was an orchestra academy in Germany until a week before the audition. I didn't know a lot of things, but a lot of people have very graciously helped me along the way. And I think if you can love what you do, then that happens.
Kurt Maroki said the most beautiful thing to me when I was chatting with him 3 years ago or so. I was asking him some nerdy question of like, what do you practice, Kurt? And he just said, I start every day with love and joy. Which is such a simple thing, but such a beautiful thing. If you think about it, like pull out the instrument, play a note, and just sort of relish that sound. I mean, that's such a better way than pulling out my checklist of the 37 things that I want to work on in my Beethoven excerpts.
Yeah. I mean, it took me a long time to learn how to love excerpts, and also mostly from teaching them actually later. And I love them now, and I didn't before. You've got to, because in the end you are your own teacher, and you make your own path. You have to make your own path, even if you get a job in an orchestra. You have to find out what your role is going to be in that section and in that group of people. I mean, you have to create your own way anyway. So, start early.
There you go. My conversation with Erik Higgins. I really hope you enjoyed this. I got so much out of chatting with Erik. These are the kind of conversations that get me inspired and fired up to keep making progress on, you name it, bass, podcasting, writing, everything. And just that concept of being interested, I found so fascinating. I haven't really talked about people about that concept with people that much in the past, and such a cool topic. Thank you, Erik. Links to everything we talked about, or most of what we talked about, in the show notes. And that's going to do it for another episode of Contrabass Conversations. I have so much fun doing these each and every week. We've got a great team putting these together. Michael Cooper and Steve Hinchy are our audio editors. Mitch Mooring is our audio engineer. Trevor Jones takes care of publication and promotion. And I am your host, Jason Heath, coming to you each and every week from San Francisco, California, where if I listen close, I can hear the sea lions barking. And I'm not kidding. I live close to the sea lions. Learn more about what we've been up to for the past decade plus at our website, contrabassconversations.com. And we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.